what today's about is Local Multiplier 3, which is a methodology that we've been using probably for the last 9 years. And it's all about understanding how spend circulates and impacts upon local economies and local places. What I want to do is 4 things really over the course of the next hour. Firstly, why does local economic spend matter? So I want to talk about some of the theories to why we as an organisation, CLES, an economic development organisation, are bothered about local spend and the impact it has upon places and people. I want to talk about the basics of what Local Multiplier 3 methodology is, so the various strands of activity that you have to undertake. Third, I want to talk to you about how to undertake an LM3 analysis and the various rounds of analysis that you have to explore. And fourth, I want to talk about examples of where we've deployed this, because we've used this both across the UK, into Europe and in the United States as well. So just in terms of why we're bothered about this, this is always a picture that I show when we're trying to justify why we're interested in local economic spend. The picture on the right-hand side is how we feel economic development policy, inward investment policy, the way in which places have gone about procurement has operated for the last 30 years. So we've had lots of money go in through things like urban development corporations, city challenge, neighbourhood renewal funding, a whole host of procurement spend going into our places. But in a lot of localities, the same challenges prevail. So we've still got issues in terms of the physical appearance of our places, issues around poverty and inequality, issues around jobs, issues around kind of skills. And our thinking is that economic development and procurement and investment should look more like the picture on the left. So you've got money going into those places, and that money is circulating and sticking within that locality, and you're getting a whole range of benefits from that investment in that particular place. So you get good jobs, good places, and you address some of the challenges of poverty and inequality that exist. I mean, if you look, the picture on the right is, if you think about places like Canary Wharf in London, that's kind of what's happened in Canary Wharf. So you'd have lots of investment through financial services, but if you go to Tower Hamlets and Newham and Hackney, you've still got huge issues in terms of kind of inequality and poverty within those localities. So that's kind of drives the whole approach of CLES as an organisation. We want to try and move towards more effective, more progressive local economic development where money sticks and circulates in local economies. And that kind of led us to our work around public procurement, and we started this probably around about 9 years ago, and it was a result of 3 frustrations with the way in which public procurement had been undertaken in the UK. First was the scale of the spend. I think at the time central government spent something around about £270 billion a year buying goods and services, so purchasing. Local authorities spent about £70 billion a year buying goods and services. Then we had the NHS, housing organisations, and also private sector organisations. But of that £70 billion of local government spend, there was no real understanding of where that money went or what impact it had upon those particular local places or those local economies. So we wanted to try and develop a way of understanding that spend, where it went and what impact it had upon place. The second frustration that we had around procurement was that there's always been a huge number of myths around procurement and what you actually can do within the remit of European procurement regulations. And by speaking to procurement officers in local government, there was always the excuse, well, we can't do things at a local level because of EU procurement law. So we wanted to try and have a think about how you could actually overcome some of those challenges and barriers around procurement. And the third thing was that we felt there was an intrinsic link between procurement and local economic development. If you did procurement properly, you purchasing properly, you could actually also address some of the key economic development challenges facing place. And that includes the creation of jobs, the development of businesses and small to medium-sized enterprises, development of social enterprises, and also addressing environmental issues as well. So over the course of the last 9 years, we've done 3 key activities in response to those frustrations, and Local Multiplier 3 fits into the first one, which is around evidence gathering. So we've done a range of pieces of work trying to understand how procurement spend predominantly circulates and impacts upon local economies and places. We've done work both in individual localities, but also with the Federation of Small Businesses. So we've gathered data across 200 local authorities as to the impact procurement spend is having upon their own place and upon small business within that locality. The second thing, and I'll come on to this in a bit more detail later on, is that we've really tried to shift the culture of procurement teams in local government. So if you'd have walked into Manchester City Council, I hope there's no one here from Manchester City Council. No, good. If you'd have walked in there, 8 years ago, what you'd have found is a procurement department that wasn't engaged with commissioners of services. So they weren't engaged with children's services, adult social care. They weren't engaged with the economic development department. What we've done is to try and shift that culture so that those different departments become far more coordinated when it comes to the process of procurement. And then the third thing that we've tried to do is really influence the behaviour of local government and other public sector bodies, but also of the supply chain, because I think there's only so much that local authorities can do when it comes to procurement. Where the real benefit can be felt is what the supply chain does. So private, voluntary and community sector organisations delivering more effectively through the resource that they receive through the procurement process. So the purpose of today is really to talk about this Local Multiplier 3 model, and I suppose there's a caveat to say straight away is that CLES didn't design this model. We did what all good research people do, we stole it from someone else. So the New Economics Foundation developed this in about 2003. They're a similar organisations to ourselves, and what they were interested in was understanding the impact of neighbourhood regeneration programmes and projects and how the money invested in those projects circulated in particular local economies. That was great, but it only had a kind of a relatively small shelf life in it. They was looking at kind of spend of around about £200,000 up to £1 million in terms of relatively small regeneration projects. What we wanted to do was really have a look at the totality of spend within a particular place. So we started doing this work in Swindon, and we looked at their commercial services department, and that includes everything from kind of refuse collection to highways maintenance, to buildings maintenance, to grounds maintenance and parks type activities. And what we wanted to know, then try and understand, was the impact that £64 million worth of investment in that service brought for the local economy. So we started deploying Local Multiplier 3. In terms of what each of the strands of it stand for, so L relates to geography. So we've used this to kind of look at impact at a number of different geographical levels. So we can use this model at neighbourhood level, we can use this model at ward level, we can use it at local authority level, and we've also used it at kind of combined authority stroke city region level. So it's kind of up to you if you're looking at doing a piece of LM3 analysis to decide upon what geography you want to kind of demonstrate impact at. M stands for how that the money that's invested in a project or a department or a local authority multiplies within an economy, so how it kind of circulates and generates greater income through that economy. And 3 stands for the 3 rounds of analysis that are undertaken, and I'll just talk through each of them briefly before we go on to look at exactly what data and information you need to collect to undertake analysis. So round 1, and what I should say, this could be applied to a university department, it can be applied to a regeneration project. We've also looked at construction projects, and we've looked at the totality of local authority budgets. We've looked at all the spend of the combined authority on purchasing goods and services in Greater Manchester. So there's a range of different geographical levels and areas of spend which you can deploy LM3 at. So the first thing that you look at as part of an LM3 analysis is total spend. So this is everything that's been spent by that project, by that department over a defined time period. So by everything I mean, that's everything that's spent purchasing goods and services, so procurement. It's everything that's spent upon employee wages, so people who may work in that department or authority, and it's everything including overhead. So you've got effectively a base figure. And as I said before, in Swindon we started with a base figure of £64 million. In Greater Manchester, in the work that we did with AGMA, we started with a base figure of £1 billion. In Manchester City Council, we started with a base figure of £357 million. So that is everything that is spent over a defined period of time, often a year, on everything associated with that local authority or that kind of particular aspect of spend. The second thing that we're interested in is the supply chain. So we're interested in where suppliers are based effectively. So if we're doing this kind of piece of analysis for a local authority, we're interested in the proportion of spend which is with organisations, businesses based within Manchester, for example. So if we're looking at this at a Manchester City Council level, so we're interested in analysing procurement spend, so then the organisations that are procured to deliver goods and services for that particular authority or that department or that project. The second aspect of round 2 is that we're interested in direct employees working for that project or for that department or for that authority, and we're interested in the proportion of spend upon wages, which is with employees who also live within that particular area. So again, if we're doing this for Manchester, we're doing it for Manchester City Council, be interested in the proportion of spend on wages that's with people who live in that particular locality. There's varying degrees of analysis that you can do with both those aspects. So for supply chain stuff, we've also looked at the sector of organisations providing goods and services for local authorities in particular. We've looked at the extent to which organisations are SMEs or charities or social enterprises. We've looked at the extent to which employees live in areas of deprivation within that particular locality and the impact that spend upon wages has upon particular deprived neighbourhoods. It's important to say, I think, round 1 and round 2, that's information that all public authorities or organisations that you potentially work for should have readily available. So total spend can come from annual accounts or management accounts, spend upon suppliers. If you're doing procurement properly, you should have a log of where you're spending all your money. And I'll come on to kind of how we gather that data in a minute. And then employee stuff through kind of payroll. So the first 2 rounds are relatively straightforward. The third round is where there's kind of a need for more kind of primary focused research. So at round 3, we're interested in how suppliers that have been procured to provide a particular good or service then re-spend back in the local economy upon their own suppliers and their own local employees. And that's done through a survey, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But as we've been doing this for kind of 9 years, what we've done is been able to develop proxies based upon particular places as to what that round 3 figure could be. So you don't necessarily have to do that primary research. And the second aspect of round 3 is that we're also interested in how direct employees re-spend back in the local economy in shops, services, petrol, transport, all those kind of key kind of areas of spend. And the whole idea behind it is that at the end of it, you add together your total spend, your initial investment, you add together what is spent in the local economy through procurement and through spend on employee wages, and then what is re-spent in the local economy by suppliers and employees back in that particular local economy. Divide it by the initial investment and you get a ratio figure for every pound that you're spending through that service or through that authority. You get an X amount being spent and re-spent back in the local economy. So those are the basic kind of principles behind it. Are there any questions at this stage or thoughts? It's pretty kind of logical, and the work that we've done, we think that all kind of public investment should have this sort of kind of methodology applied to it, so that people understand the impact that their investment is having. And it links back to the picture that I showed earlier.
So I was just thinking about the big employers like
Yep.
Asda, Walmart,
Yep.
Manchester. So spending it in Asda, Walmart, which
It does. I mean, and this is one of the caveats. You could go down so many lines of inquiry with this, and I'll come on to it in the surveys, but the surveys basically ask, what do you spend on a kind of a monthly basis on shopping, and what do you spend in local shops, and that can include Asda, Walmart, but you could really kind of complicate the methodology by saying, well, how much do you actually spend in local independent shops, for example? But you could go so many, you could end up with LM6 if you really wanted to. It's just about kind of getting an understanding of that kind of initial spend by an individual back in a particular local economy. But organisations like Asda, Walmart do create local job opportunities. They have got apprenticeship type schemes, so there is some sort of kind of reinvestment back in that local economy as a result of that organisation being an anchor within that place. So in terms of what you need to do to undertake this type of analysis, the first thing that we've always felt is important is to get buy-in from the service area or organisation that you want to do LM3 with. And this is no easy feat. We're an external organisation working with local authorities. And so a lot of the time we've had to convince them of the kind of the value of undertaking this analysis. So if you work for the university, for example, you know, you're going to have to kind of convince senior people within the university that this is a valuable thing to do in terms of kind of demonstrating the impact of the organisation. The second thing that you need to do is collect postcode data for the geographical area that you're looking at. Because this is really important, because the way in which you analyse the extent to which spend is local or the extent to which wages are local is by cross-referencing an organisation's postcode against all the postcodes within that particular geography or that locality. So the first thing that we always do is collect every single postcode in that locality. This is for when I did the work in West Lothian. So in column A we've got every single postcode within West Lothian. So then we can, when we get the business data, we can then kind of cross-reference it against those postcodes. What we've also found really interesting is to also collect super output, lower super output area data, so that we can understand the extent to which suppliers and employees are based or resident in areas of deprivation, so we can cross-reference data zone information against the indices of deprivation to try and understand the extent to which people live and work in areas of deprivation. So that is the key kind of starting point for LM3. You've got to have them postcodes, otherwise you can't do the analysis. Third important thing is that you need commitment to data for a specific time period. We've always said that the best time to do an LM3 analysis is at the end of the financial year. So then you know exactly how much has been spent in wages upon staff members. You know exactly how much has been spent upon procuring goods and services and all the organisations that deliver those goods and services. So you've got a true record. I mean, as an external organisation, it's not always been possible to do this at the end of a financial year, because someone will come to us in November and say, look, we fancy having a look at our spend and the impact it has. But what we've always said is that you need a minimum of kind of 9 months of robust information to be able to do LM3 analysis. It used to be a lot more difficult kind of 5 years ago, because you always used to have the kind of funny period in local government in March where they tried to get everything out of the door. So March was always kind of skewed. But as a rule of thumb, a minimum of 9 months of real data to enable LM3 to be undertaken. When I started doing this, I didn't know anything about, we did a lot of this with kind of refuse and other frontline service departments, so I didn't have a clue what those kind of departments did. So we used to collect a lot of information about service areas and their business plan documentation, and how that linked into kind of wider corporate strategy of the place, because I think, a lot of the time frontline service departments are employing local people because the branches were relatively local to where people lived. And then onto the actual data that you need to collect. If you remember round one, and apologise if you can't quite see this, but round one was the total spend. So this is your effective base figure. This is everything that service department or authority spends its resource on in a particular financial year. So it's overheads, employees, and procurement. Again, this is from West Lothian, and what we did here was effectively 7 pieces of LM3 analysis. In column A, you've got this was their kind of operational services department, which was made up of 7 key service areas, including roads and waste and neighbourhood environmental teams and facilities management. So we're interested in understanding the impact of all those 7 areas of service, but we're also interested in looking at the totality of impact across that particular service department. So our total spend figure, our base figure, was that £43 million as the starting point for our analysis. And that's the kind of the base figure that we undertake. So you need that, again, as well as the postcode stuff, as well as the time stuff. You need a figure for the total spend of that particular organisation or that department or that authority to get this work underway. And look, basically what we did was kind of just ask people who worked in finance to share the data. And then moving on to round 2. If you remember, there's 2 aspects to this. One is about kind of understanding the localness of your supply chain. And what we do here is ask authorities to provide a number of pieces of data, which can often be drawn from kind of procurement systems. So we ask always for the supplier name because we need that at round 3 in terms of kind of that survey of the supply chain. We ask for their full postcode, and then again there's a bit of a caveat on this because sometimes what you'll get is an administrative postcode. So for an organisation like Lango Rourke, which are a construction contractor, they're based out of Maidstone. All the invoices issued go to Maidstone, but actually they've got a branch in Hume in Manchester. So we ask for the postcodes, and then we do a little bit of kind of quality checking of those postcodes. And then if we find that there's a branch of that particular organisation, we then use that secondary postcode as a way of undertaking the analysis, because we know that the vast majority of the resources go into that particular branch. So we ask for name, postcode, and then the total spend in that particular financial year or the particular period that you're looking at undertaking LM3 analysis for. So this is Belfast's supply chain for Belfast City Council supply chain for financial year 14-15. And then when it comes to if you want to do a bit more kind of intelligent analysis around supply chains, we also ask for sectors, and we link this to the standard industrial classification codes. We also ask information about the size of the company. It's interesting to know the extent to which authorities or organisations are spending with SMEs. And also, I'm trying to think if there's anything else. We also ask if they've got a particular email address for that supplier, because when it comes to round 3 in the supplier survey, you need an email address to send that information out to them. So every area that we do this work in, we ask them for this information about the supply chain for a year or the period that they're looking at.
Do they normally know whether the size of the firm?
Well, that's a good question. Some authorities have become quite good at doing it. So on average, we'll probably get, I don't know, probably about 50% of the records. If not, we've got access to something called the Mint database, which is run by, I think, Bureau van Dijk, and you could type in any organisation's name into that database, and that will tell you the size of those organisations. So we can then add it to this spreadsheet before we do that analysis. It's the same on the business sector. Not all authorities will collect information about the business sector of their suppliers, but what we can do is log into Companies House, type in the name of the organisation, and you can get the broad SIC code for that particular organisation. So it depends on the place which you're doing it. Sometimes we've been really lucky, like Belfast. That's basically what they provided us with. So we just had to go through the kind of the postcode analysis and kind of lock people into particular sectors. Other places where we've done this, we've had virtually no information for business sector or supply side. So some poor researchers has had to Google and go through Companies House and Bureau van Dijk data to make sure we've got a full and true record. Yeah. So that's the second aspect, data about the supply chain, and then the way in which we go about analysing this. If you think we've got our sheet of postcodes, all we then do is do a lookup formula in Excel to see if that postcode there correlates with the postcodes to the geographical area that we're undertaking the analysis for, and it comes up with an NA or a kind of a duplication of that record if it is within that particular local economy. We then add up all the spend that's in the local area that we're looking at. Okay, and then the second aspect of round 2 is around employee wages, and we've deployed 2 methods in doing this. Sometimes local authorities in particular are a bit funny about giving external organisations, due to data protection issues, information about their employees. So we've done it one of 2 ways. The first is that we've kind of collected this sort of data, which is everything that they spend on gross wages for their employees. So again, this is from West Lothian, and this is I think it was for the neighbourhood environmental team. So they spent in that year £5.8 million on gross wages. And then what we also ask for them is a set of postcodes. And then what we do is average out those wages across all workers, so that we don't have sensitive information about every individual that works for that particular department, and in terms of their wages. The other way of doing it is that we do collect that, but we don't have any kind of identification of the individual in terms of their name or their role within the organisation. We collect their home postcode, their gross salary, and their net salary. When it comes to kind of doing the analysis for employees, we need that net salary because we're basically knocking off income taxation, pension contributions, national insurance contributions, because that is non-local spend. So on the second part of the round 2 analysis in terms of the employee wages, we're looking at kind of net salary rather than gross salary. And we're doing exactly the same kind of analysis. We're cross-referencing postcodes against the postcodes that we've got for that particular geographical area to work out the percentage of spend which is within that particular local economy. Happy? Yeah? Okay, great. And then, so that's round 1 and 2. So we've got the total spend, we've got the spend on supplies and the spend upon employees. As I said, there's 2 ways of doing this. We could adopt a primary research way of kind of trying to understand the respend of supplies and employees back in the local economy. And we can also utilise proxies, and I'll talk about the proxies in a little bit more detail in a minute. But if we're going down a primary research route, we need to do 2 surveys. The first is of direct employees. And I had an awful lot of fun in Swindon when I first started doing this, because we were doing this with refuse collectors at 5 o'clock in the morning as they're about to go out on shift. But what we're interested in here is what they spend in total across a range of different categories on a monthly basis. So the categories we look at are things like shopping, socialising, transport, mortgage and rent, insurance, savings. So everything they spend on that on a monthly basis. And then for some of the categories, what they spend in the local area. So there's things like transport and shopping, where people will spend in local shops and services. But there's also some assumptions that we make. So when we're asking questions around utilities, gas, electricity, water, we assume that none of that money is local, so that leaks. When we're asking questions about mortgage and rent, we assume if the individual's got a mortgage, that leaks, because more than likely it's going to kind of a national mortgage provider. But if they rent their home either privately or through a housing association or through the local authority, we assume that money kind of sticks within the local economy. Same on insurance and savings, because that's with kind of banks and large providers. We assume that money leaks out of the local area as well. So what we do with this is kind of ask people to fill in a questionnaire or a survey, and then we tot up both the total spend for all those employees that we speak to, and we tot up the local spend for those employees that we speak to get a figure for every pound invested with that employee, how much they spend back in that particular local economy. We've done this in a number of ways. So in Swindon, as I said, we went down there, sat down with these bin men. I often went, I'm not sure how health and safety conscious this was, but I went round on some of their rounds with the refuse collectors just to try and get them to fill it in there and then. Lesson from that is that we didn't get great, robust data. What we then did when we subsequently done this is said, look, take this away. Here's a free post envelope. Have a chat with your partner about it, and we've tended to get more robust data around that. Some other things that we've done just to kind of qualify and make sure that the data's of sufficient quality. We've also asked a proportion of people that we've spoken to fill out spend diaries. So this is based upon an estimation. Spend diaries is real spend, and we've done that with kind of a proportion of the people that we engage with, and there's been some great stories that have come out of that. There was a guy in Swindon who he went out on a Saturday night with his mates. He spent quite a lot of money, and then he put in at midnight. He bought a dog off his friend for 50 quid, and then he on the Sunday morning in his spend diary, two tins of pedigree chum from the local shop. So we can do those kind of spend diaries as well. So that's the employee thing. What we do is kind of take a sample. So we wouldn't, for that £64 million to spend by Swindon Commercial Services, there's no way we could have interviewed or done the questionnaire with everyone. What we look is for a kind of a minimum 20% of employees to respond to that, and then proxy it up based upon those particular responses.
How do you get them to understand local in the survey?
So what we can do is a couple of things we can tell them what the kind of local area that we're looking at. We often kind of provide a map that kind of shows them the area that we defined, so that they then kind of get a kind of an understanding of what that geography constitutes. I think in places like Belfast, we've kind of complicated things a bit because they've wanted to understand the spend of their employees both at Belfast City level, which is quite a compact boundary, but also at the wider city region level. So we've had to explain what kind of 6 other local authorities make up the kind of the city region as well, which has proved more complicated because then people have struggled to kind of define what's Belfast City region. So it's all in the kind of the visuals that you kind of provide along with it. And then the other aspect is the supply chain survey. So what we're interested in here is the extent to which suppliers which have been procured to provide a good or service re-spend back in the local economy upon local employees and local suppliers of their own. So what we do is effectively ask 6 questions. We're interested in, on the employee side of things, what proportion of their total expenditures and organisations upon employee wages. We're also interested in how many employees they have in total, and we're also interested in how many local employees they have in total. So if they have for example, they have a procurement contract of £100,000 and they tell us that they spend 50% of their spend upon employee wages, that's £50,000 of that. If they then tell us that they've got 10 suppliers, divide that £50,000 by 10, £5,000 per supplier. They then tell us that they're 10 employees. They then tell us they've got 2 local employees, multiply by that 2. So for that initial £50,000 investment in that organisation, you're getting £10,000 of return for the local economy through the employees of that organisation. Exactly the same analysis on the supply chain. So we ask them what proportion they spend on suppliers, how many suppliers they have in total, how many local suppliers they have in, for that particular kind of contract or activity. And again, at the end of it all, tot it all up for the organisations that are replied to the survey and use proxies for those that haven't responded to the survey. Again, different ways of doing this. Just an important thing on this is all suppliers. So it's not just organisations that are based in the local area. This is regardless of geography. So this is every supplier that provides a good or service. Because, well, obviously local suppliers will probably spend more in that particular local economy than non-local suppliers. In terms of doing this, the first time we did it, we had a bit of a drive around a few suppliers, dropped it off, got them to fill it in. But we've kind of evolved this so it's now done more on a kind of electronic basis. So that's why it's important to collect information about email addresses so that this survey can be sent out through SurveyMonkey electronically to suppliers. I've always been amazed by the kind of the response rate we've got to this because it's always been relatively high, often between 33% and 50% of suppliers respond to this. But I've always felt that that's because, one, we often get a director of procurement or a chief executive to sign it off. A supplier automatically starts thinking, why are they asking these sort of questions? My contract's kind of coming up to renewal in a year. This may kind of influence a few things. So there's a kind of a perception, I think, amongst the supply chain that they need to do this. But as kind of the social value agenda's evolved, we've kind of gone a little bit more mature in terms of some of the questions that we ask on this, and I'll talk about that again in a moment. So that's all the data that you need to collect. So total spend, information about overhead, suppliers, employees. The round 2, information about supply chain. Round 2, also information about employees and their wages. And round 3, you can either use these surveys or use these proxies, and I'll send the proxies round after this session in terms of kind of what we've developed and what we've used as proxies for both the supplier and the employee survey. So in terms of how that looks in reality, this is the example that I gave for Belfast. So we've got that total spend of 160.8 million, so that was our base figure in Belfast. We then looked at their supply chain, and this included both revenue and capital suppliers, so construction and service suppliers. And for the revenue, we found about 50% was being spent in the Belfast boundary. We looked at employees, so about 56% of a net spend of 49 million was being spent upon employees resident in Belfast. And then we did the supplier survey and worked out that 21 pence in every pound we spent back in Belfast by suppliers, and employees re-spent 26p in every pound back in Belfast. And at the end of it, we did the LM3 analysis, total spend plus spend with local suppliers and local employees, plus the re-spend of suppliers and employees back in the local economy divided by the initial investment gave us our LM3 of 1.70, which effectively means for every pound spent by Belfast City Council, there's getting a return or a multiplier effect of 70 pence being spent or re-spent back in the local economy. What I've always said is that figure's not that important. It's the process that you go through to get to that figure that's the important aspect. So understanding your supply chain, understanding where there's potentially gaps in spend, understanding where kind of suppliers are bringing real kind of social value and benefit through procurement, are the kind of the real meaty elements of this, rather than that kind of 1.70 figure. And sometimes people get a little bit kind of hung up on that multiplier ratio. So in terms of where we've used it and why we've used it, Swindon Commercial Services, this was used because I think this was 2007. They were becoming under increasing pressure to outsource that service to the private sector. So they wanted to kind of demonstrate the value of in-house provision. And the value of in-house provision was that that particular service employed lots of local people. It brought benefit in terms of kind of spend with suppliers and businesses based in Swindon, and those organisations had a knock-on effect in terms of the local economy. So we've used that on a couple of occasions to justify in-house provision. In North Liverpool and South Sefton, we used this because the council wanted to contract more social enterprises to deliver public services. And this was a way of kind of working with, I think we worked with 6 social enterprises to look at their existing impact as a way of kind of framing procurement exercises. Lancashire County Developments Limited, we did this on a particular construction project, so £6 million enterprise centre in Rawtenstall to look at the impact of that upon the local economy, which was very minimal actually. Manchester I want to come on to in a minute to look at how we've adapted and utilised LM3 in a bit more detail, and Preston I'll come on to in a moment. So we've done kind of full LM3 analysis in quite a few places, but what Manchester City Council were interested in was more the kind of the impact of their procurement spend. So you don't have to do all the aspects of LM3, you can use it for particular aspects of analysis for whatever you want. And Manchester asked us to do a bit of work back in 2008, 2009, because they didn't really have a full understanding of the impact that their procurement spend had upon the Manchester economy or the Greater Manchester economy. So we did 2 of the aspects of LM3 with Manchester City Council. We looked at their supply chain, so we looked at £357 million, and we also looked at kind of how their suppliers re-spent back in the Manchester economy. And at that point, in 2008, 2009, about 51.5% of spend was with Manchester-based businesses, which is pretty good. The benchmarking that we've done with the Federation of Small Businesses, on average, local authorities will spend 27.1% of their spend back in their local economy. So Manchester's well ahead of that. But what I would say on that is that Manchester's a metropolitan area. There's lots of businesses here. They've got access to lots of different opportunities when it kind of comes to procuring goods and services. So you're going to have a greater level of investment in the local economy. Also, 2008, 2009, the supplier re-spend figure was 25p in the pound. So it's 25p being re-spent back by suppliers upon local employees and local suppliers of their own. I'll come back to how things have changed after I've taught you through some of the things that we've done with their procurement department to try and increase those levels of local spend and the levels of re-spend by the supply chain. And again, the important thing with this is that it takes time. You know, this is an 8-year process that we've been working through with the City Council to kind of change the way in which their procurement department thinks about spend and the impact that they have and their relationship with economic development. So there's been a number of things that we've done. The first thing is that like any procurer, Manchester City Council has invitation to tender documents. They have pre-qualification questionnaires, and what we've done at the front end of each of those documents is put what Manchester City Council's corporate priorities are. And at the point of starting this, the corporate priorities were around reducing worklessness, raising aspiration in the city, and increasing private sector growth. And by putting that in the tender documentation, it automatically got suppliers thinking, well, actually, Manchester City Council are asking us to demonstrate how we're going to kind of contribute to those corporate priorities through the delivery of services and through the delivery of goods. So they were given an opportunity in their responses to say how they would actually contribute to those kind of corporate priorities, whether it be around creating jobs, developing apprenticeships, supporting the voluntary and community sector, reducing carbon emissions. They were given the opportunity to demonstrate that. Linked into that, Manchester City Council then started to score that in terms of the tender responses and the criteria that they utilised. Up until about 3 months ago, it was a minimum of 10% of the decision was set aside for social value considerations. So they had the usual kind of consideration about cost, the consideration about quality, but then there was a minimum 10% for every procurement that was linked, that was around kind of social value and linked into those corporate priorities. At council in February, that was increased to 20%. And Manchester is one of the few local authorities that are actually doing scoring around kind of social value. That's not to say it's not without its problems, because there's still difficulties in actually defining and the supply chain understanding what is meant by social value and what constitutes social value. But at least it's a start in terms of kind of getting both the city council and suppliers thinking about social value. It depends upon the contract. So if it's a service contract above the European Union thresholds of, I think 150,000, I think it is, yes, they have to consider it. But Manchester's gone a little bit further in that they've applied it to goods and also kind of capital type projects as well. So yes and no, they do, but only for certain thresholds. The other thing that they've done is, as I said at the outset, you know, there was quite a lot of silo working in the City Council in terms of kind of departments not really talking to each other. So what we did was set up a departmental commission and procurement group, and this brought together the procurement people with commissioners in adult social care, children's services, economic development people as well. And I think that relationship between economic development and procurement has been key, because economic development people know who the businesses are in Manchester and Greater Manchester, and they know who the procurement people need to engage with when it comes to kind of meet the buyer events and other forms of engagement with the supply chain. The other things that we did was, what we often felt was that you know, a contract to be procured and the supplier would go away and they'd deliver a very nice service, provide a good, and there was no real contact or engagement between the council and the supply chain until the contract came up for renewal. And there was certainly no opportunity for the City Council to influence the behaviour of the supply chain when it came to things like social value. So we did two things. We set up a network of suppliers, which came together on a quarterly basis. So people talked about what they were doing around kind of social value and wider benefit through the delivery of their service or their good. And then we identified the businesses that were based in Manchester neighbourhoods in the 10% most deprived nationally. And the economic development people went to see them. And one of the best examples of this is that an organisation in Gorton had a £5 million recycling contract. They didn't utilise any local labour. They didn't utilise any Manchester-based suppliers. The economic development people basically used kind of a bit of kind of scare tactics and said to them, look, you're based in Gorton. Do you know 70% of the people who live on that estate don't work? What is your organisation going to do about it in relation to this contract? So what that organisation has then done as they've expanded is actually they've started to engage with neighbourhood employment brokers, and they've supported, I think, 10 people from that estate into employment opportunity through the delivery of that particular contract. So there's something about influencing behaviour kind of organically through the procurement process. There's all sorts of kind of clauses you can put in it, but Manchester's found a way of doing that through an informal engagement with the supply chain. The other things that have been done, they've started to kind of not only kind of monitor spend on an ongoing basis, and I'll come back to them figures in a minute, but they've also developed an outcomes framework of the things that they want procurement to actually achieve. So suppliers now need to record the number of jobs that they've created in a particular year. They need to record the number of apprenticeships they've created. They need to record the number of volunteering hours their staff have been undertaking. They need to record the number of hours of support they've provided to the voluntary community sector. So it all gives a much more robust understanding of the indirect impact of that particular spend. The other thing that they've done is kind of developed a better understanding of the business base in the city region, so understanding of the organisations who can potentially deliver goods and services that are based in Greater Manchester. So the impact of all that is that we've seen that 51.5% figure that I mentioned grow now to 2014-15 to 68.9% of all spend being with Manchester-based organisations and businesses, and that's through better engagement, getting to know the business base better, altering your procurement processes slightly, and also that 25p in the pound respend by the supply chain now stands at 36p in the pound. So that influence in behaviour around kind of social value has also had an impact upon the behaviour of the supply chain as well. Any thoughts or questions on what Manchester have been up to? It's not a finished story yet. They've still got work to do in terms of kind of changing some of their processes, particularly around social value.
Just kind of observation.
Yeah.
More resources being spent in Manchester, therefore less resources are being spent outside Manchester.
Yeah.
So there's a my neighbour.
Yeah, we've also always been very careful about geography and where kind of we identify gaps in spend. So when we do this kind of analysis, if we're looking at leakage, is what we call it, we always identify something that's not basically in the northwest region already. So we're encouraging the City Council to think differently about how it procures and where it procures from, but not at the expense of other business within the particular region, or often within the north of England. So what we also do is kind of think about, well, what spend is actually influenceable and what spend is not influenceable. And there's certain things that Manchester City Council will never be able to buy in the Manchester economy. Energy being one, for example, unless you've got kind of municipal energy kind of production. So what we do is kind of work with them to identify what's influenceable, what's not influenceable, what's not going to have a knock-on consequence for other economies within the close vicinity to Manchester. Yeah, so that's... Go on.
Have they written up anywhere? Have you written it?
Yeah, I mean, we produce a report from them every year, looking at the analysis. I'm just working on a publication at the moment which will explore everything that's happened over the last 8 years with Manchester City Council. But I'm happy to circulate some of the analysis that we've done previously over the last 8 years. There is a publication from 2010 which talks about the baseline stuff, but I can send you some reports, Ruth.
And that looks like about 50 million extra.
Uh-huh.
Have you got any idea how much they spent on analysis and visiting businesses in court or anything like that? So you could say, for the amount we put in to change this, we generate. I
couldn't tell you how much they've spent. Well, I can tell you how much they spent on us. But in terms of kind of what we see is it's an economic development role. You know, the function of economic development should be to engage with communities, and I suppose Manchester's lucky enough to have the kind of 5. It used to be the 5. It's now down to 3 strategic regeneration areas, each with officer time allocated to that. They kind of took a strategic decision to work with the procurement department because they felt there's real economic benefit to actually having better engagement with the supply chain. So I couldn't tell you a figure, but I would have thought if you did a cost-benefit analysis study of it, you'd have a much greater impact. And I think, you know, just that example from Gorton's just one example of where jobs have been created. What this is doing is organically influencing the behaviour of the supply chain. I think it's also dependent upon sector as well. I think the construction sector have done this sort of stuff for a long time, but if you were went and talked to like someone like Enterprise who've been responsible for waste, they would never have thought about kind of social value or kind of delivering greater economic benefit through procurement if it wasn't for this kind of engagement that was going on. Okay, got about 10 minutes, I think. Just wanted to touch upon a couple of other things that we've done around this kind of whole agenda. We felt that a couple of years ago that this shouldn't just be restricted to local government. There's a range of different institutions within place which employ significant numbers of people, that have significant spend on procurement, that are probably unlikely to leave that locality. And what we've termed them, it's come from the States, we've termed them anchor institutions. So those organisations that won't leave the locality but have the potential to bring significant wealth to that particular locality if they do procurement and other aspects of their core business right. So we started doing some work in Preston, and we've worked here with 7 anchor institutions. So we've worked with the University of Central Lancashire, Preston City Council, Lancashire County Council, 2 further education colleges, a housing association and the constabulary. And what the whole purpose of this work was to get them thinking about their spend and what impact it had upon Preston and the wealth that could be generated through that. Again, LM3 was our starting point. We needed a baseline understanding of what impact those organisations had. And the first thing that we've got from that is an evidence base. So we now understand across £1 billion of spend across those 7 institutions where it goes. And in stark contrast to Manchester, just 5% of that spend across those institutions is in the Preston economy, and just 39% is in wider Lancashire. So there's a far more greater significant level of leakage in those anchor institutions in Preston. What we've done then is to kind of work with them a lot closely to identify what we talked about a moment ago, which is influenceable and non-influenceable spend. So for Preston City Council in particular, we've identified £3 million of spend which is leaking out of Lancashire, which we felt could potentially be influenced. And that was in the sectors of construction, materials, vehicles activities, and funnily consultants. We were in there doing a kind of a consultancy piece of work, and one of the biggest areas of leakage was in consultancy. So what we've done with that is identified key areas of service which we think are influenceable. And the idea behind that is that when it comes to kind of procuring for those services in the future, they can then use this database of Preston-based businesses, which we've put together for them, to have some pre-market engagement. So say they're looking to kind of, I don't know, let out a building maintenance contract, a cleaning contract. 6 months before they go out to tender, they then have this list of organisations based in Preston, which they can potentially do some pre-market engagement with and work with them to scope whether they have the skills, the capacity, the knowledge, the ability to potentially deliver that service. The procurement's still done in exactly the same way. It's done on a value for money basis, but it's given these organisations an awareness of what opportunities are coming up before they actually go out to the market. So we've developed this, and each of those institutions are now using this on procurements where there's identified leakage out of Lancashire. And it's had an impact. So I think in Preston, after we've put that database together, spend in Lancashire, in Preston, sorry, is up from 14% to 17%, and in Lancashire from 29% to 33.5%. So having that ability to understand your market a little bit more effectively has had an impact. One of the whole purposes of the work in Preston was to actually change the behaviour of these anchor institutions, because again they adopted a very kind of risk-averse attitude when it came to procurement, and as a result of using LM3 and gathering evidence and understanding, we've actually kind of organically changed the behaviour of some of those institutions. So, for example, Lancashire County Council now have a new procurement strategy, and it has within that a focus upon social value. They have a social value procurement framework, which they again use as a criteria when it comes to scoring organisations that bid for particular opportunities. The police have done a lot. with organisations like the police and NHS and to a degree universities, a lot of stuff will be tied up in national frameworks. So they've identified spend that's not tied up in national frameworks and look to kind of repatriate that back to the local economy where there's a best value supplier to deliver that. Picture of my mugshot. That's another publication that we launched last year, which kind of highlights the findings that piece of work in Preston and also some of the change that's gone on in those anchor institutions. I mentioned earlier that I'm working in Europe. We've got funding through a European Union funding programme called URBAC 3. So I'm now providing advice to 11 cities across Europe around how they go about doing procurement using LM3 and spend analysis as the basis of that to changing their behaviour and practice. So I've been lucky enough to be working in Romania and Czech Republic and Croatia and Tenerife, which is always good. So that's that. And then I think nearly done. I think what we've tried to do is to try and really kind of maximise the intelligence that we're gathering through the relationship with the supply chain. So in Greater Manchester, there's now something called the Greater Manchester Social Value Procurement Framework, which is designed to shape the way in which all the 10 Greater Manchester authorities and other public institutions go about doing procurement. It's framed by 6 outcomes, which is all the added value or social value that that AGMA want out of those procurement contracts. So it's things around employment, voluntary community sector engagement, environmental considerations. We've just completed a bit of work, again, which I can share after this, developing a baseline position around that framework for the 10 Greater Manchester authorities. So we've engaged with the supply chain and we've asked them questions like how many apprenticeships have you created in the last year, how many jobs have you created, how many jobs have you employment opportunities have you created for people who live in hard to reach, from hard to reach kind of backgrounds, so BME communities, young people, disabled people. So the AGMA now have a baseline understanding of what that impact of around about £1 billion of spend is once it ripples through the supply chain. And then finally, just in terms of key lessons from all this work, and this kind of started with LM3 because I think that should always be the starting point in terms of kind of gathering evidence when it comes to procurement. If you want to make change, you need to have an understanding of where your spend's going to kind of start off with. But just some key findings. Evidence is key to that change. There's a need to work with European law. European law has often been seen as such a barrier to progressive procurement activity. There are now new regulations that came into force in February 2014, I think, which have 3 key words in them: flexibility, supporting SMEs, and achieving societal goals. So the EU have kind of changed their kind of process when it comes to procurement a little bit. So there's flexibility and opportunity to deliver some of the things that I've been talking about. Political vision is really important. We wouldn't have been able to get into Manchester City Council without the drive of the Director of Procurement or the kind of the leader of the council or the Chief Executive. There's got to be a political will and a drive to understand spend and the impact it has upon other agendas. Not all areas of spend can be influenced. This is this question around protectionism. You know, we've never kind of highlighted that this is all about protectionism. This is about kind of best value procurement and delivering maximum benefit through spend. Social value is difficult to define and measure. I still don't think anybody's got a grip on what's meant by social value or what it kind of constitutes. And you know, if local authorities and other institutions expect suppliers to demonstrate social value, they need to be very clear about what constitutes social value. It takes time. I've been working on this for 9 years, 8 years with Manchester City Council. It takes time to make a change and change the behaviour of procurement departments. I think in this city region, this is a real opportune time. If we think about devolution, if we think about the activities of the local enterprise partnership, these principles have got to be applied to the way in which they purchase, the way in which they allocate European money in particular. We have it lucky when compared to other parts of Europe. When I was in Romania, every procurement decision 100% of the decision is made on cost. So what you've got is the cheapest product, service winning that, regardless of the quality that's been offered. So we have a look at least we can start to think about quality, and we can start to think about social value. And then finally, and probably most importantly, it's too late to consider social value at the procurement stage. Commissioners of services need to be thinking about social value. I think procurement people always get a bit of a raw deal when it comes to social value because they have a criteria, they've got a mark against that criteria. It's at the commissioning stage where social value needs to be built in, and there needs to be a better understanding of potential suppliers.